Hey everybody, I didn't want to go too long without doing a thought of the day video. I needed to change scenery. Like every video I've been making, I'm in my office in front of my library. So I came down here to sit in front of the sunshine in the window and didn't want to take too long before I did another thought of the day video. One of the things I'll often do for my thought of the day series is I'll talk about books that are really meaningful to me. And a couple times those have been books by friends of mine that I've wanted to help promote. They write these books and I read it and I'm like, man, that's actually really good. And I want to help promote that. And so I've done a couple of those. Mandy Smith's book and J.R. Briggs. I was really excited to promote those books. Sometimes there are other books that I don't know the author and they're just books that mean a ton to me and they've been out sometimes for a long, long time. And today is one of those books. So just finally got around to purchasing my own copy and being able to read it. And it's not a big, huge book. Sometimes books are small and wonderful and beautiful. And this isn't the book I'm going to talk about today, but here's an example. Sometimes The Sabbath by Abraham Joshua Heschel, just a dynamite book, man. And that thing is not big. That is a short read, but dense, thick, like not thick this way, it's got some stuff you got to really think about and wrestle with and mull over. And books don't always have to be very big to just be some of the best stuff. I would call this a modern Jewish classic. Like, it's just one of the best books on Sabbath that's out there. Not super easy, like you got to take some time, but a great book. But the same author, Abraham Joshua Heschel, also wrote kind of one of the staple works for the prophets, a book called The Prophets. Now that book is not small. That book is a tome, man. That thing is thick. What do we got here? 650 pages. That is a study, and a lot of people, when they do any work on the prophets academically, this is one of the works that they always cite, and that is the prophets. Abraham Joshua Heschel does a ton of work on just what he calls the pathos. I'm not going to try to explain that here today, but he talks about the pathos of the prophet. And one of the other works that gets quoted on just so many bibliographies. And I've used it, I've heard it read to me and quoted, but I finally got my own copy, and it's been out for decades. But the other book outside of Heschel that gets used for study of prophets is The Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann. And again, this fits much more the Sabbath. It's one of those smaller books, easy as far as volume, easy to read. But just like Heschel, man, Brueggemann is there's dense, like there's so much packed into, he doesn't waste words, I'll put it that way, but just this unbelievable, book. And I just wanted to drop some bombs on you as I just flip through this. If anybody wants to, this book's been out for decades. He actually wrote a preface. What edition do I have here? He wrote a preface to the second revised edition, because let's see, in 1978 was when the first edition was written. So he actually has this preface to the second edition, and he just has some stuff. He talks about the sub-community of God's people. You may have to stop this video in the future and just reflect on some of these things in chunks, or even better, buy your own copy of the book and think about it yourself with all the other goodies. There are so many quotes in here I want to read, and I'm going to have to pass on reading. He talks about the subcommunity of God, that in such a subcommunity, there's a long and available memory. There's a long and available memory. There is a sense of pain, number 2. There's an active practice of hope. So there's a memory, there's a sense of pain, there's a practice of hope, and there's an effective mode of discourse. That's what enables the prophetic imagination to take its root. And so again, you have Heschel talking about the prophets in an abstract examination of who the prophet is, and you can learn all about the pathos of God. But then you have Brueggemann talking about the prophet, but also bridging the gap to connect it to our world. And even the second edition is still super dated. It wasn't written, I could look at the date for when the second edition is, but it's been out for a while. Let's see here. Chapter 1, the alternative community of... I'm passing such good stuff. There's so much gold in here, guys. Let's see here. The alternative community of Moses. Talks about how Moses came and established this alternative community. I wasn't going to read quotes. Here's a quote. The program of Moses is not the freeing of a little band of slaves as an escape from the empire, though that is important enough, especially if you happen to be a part of that little band. Rather, his work is nothing less than an assault on the consciousness of the empire, aimed at nothing less than the dismantling of the empire, both in its social practices and its mythic pretensions. Note the significance of Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership in integrating a lunch counter or a local bus line. Israel emerged not by Moses' hand, although not without Moses' hand, as a genuine alternative community. One of my favorite phrases, an alternative community. A different way of ordering ourselves would be another way of putting that. An alternative community. The prophetic tradition knows that it bears a genuine alternative to a theology of God's enslavement and sociology of human enslavement. That genuine alternative entrusted to us who bear that calling is rooted not in social theory or in righteous indignation or in altruism, but in the genuine alternative that Adonai is. Adonai makes possible and requires an alternative theology and an alternative sociology. Prophecy begins in discerning how genuinely alternative he is. Whew. Man, somebody stop Walter. So good. Let's see what we got. Taken all together, the Mosaic tradition affirms three things. I'm enamored with the list. Like every chapter almost in this book has a little list, orders his thoughts, and I'm like, man, it's so good. Three things the Mosaic community offers. An alternative life is lived in this very particular historical and historicizing community. So there's an alternative life that's lived right now. This community criticizes and energizes by its special memories that embrace discontinuity and genuine breaks from imperial reality. So this community has a consciousness that remembers something other than what the empire provides. This community, gathered around the memories, knows it is defined by and is at the disposal of God, who as yet is unco-opted and uncontained by the empire. So then the next chapter goes into royal consciousness, and Brueggemann talks about, so Moses came to start an alternative community, and Solomon comes and basically completely undoes that later in the story. So Solomon becomes like the anti-Moses. And if you follow Bema, you know just how purely that tracks with what we do in session 2 of the podcast. Let me see here. Where is his list for this chapter? Such good. Here's what Solomon does to undo. Here's what he said. Solomon was able to counter completely the counterculture of Moses. Number 1, he countered the economics of equality with the economics of affluence. He countered the politics of justice with the politics of oppression. He countered the religion of God's freedom with the religion of God's accessibility, or lack thereof, I would add. Were those just, I think that was the end of his list. That's how he undid what Moses had done. Let's see, next chapter. Prophetic Criticizing and the Embrace of Pathos. And this is where Brueggemann, I think, intentionally kind of intersects with the work that Heschel did in his work, because Heschel's the one that talked all about pathos in the academic conversation on the prophets. And so he talks about that. Let's see here. What do we have for a list here? The task of prophetic imagination. I love that phrase too. What a great phrase. He talks about that in the preface. The title, Prophetic Imagination. The task of prophetic imagination is to cut through the numbness, to penetrate the self-deception, so that the God of endings is confessed as Lord. Here's his list. Number 1, to offer symbols that are adequate to confront the horror and massiveness of the experience that evokes numbness and requires denial. To offer symbols that are adequate to confront the horror. Part of the prophetic imagination is that it finds symbols that help us address the horror that we see around us. Number 2, to bring to public expression those very fears and terrors that have been denied so long and suppressed so deeply we do not know they are there. How the empire loves to gaslight us, loves to just be like, oh, there's nothing wrong here, there's nothing to see here. And the prophetic imagination gives voice to those things that we know are true. Number 3, to speak metaphorically but concretely about the real deathliness that hovers over us and gnaws within us, to speak neither in rage nor with cheap grace, but with the candor both of anguish and passion. And that really does align really well with what Heschel says in the Prophets. Another great book, by the way. You're not going to go wrong by getting Heschel. Just be prepared to read 700 pages of goodness. Next chapter for Brueggemann here. What do we got here? Prophetic energizing and the emergence of amazement. Oh man, is there a list in this chapter? What do we got here? Oh, I don't even know if there's a list in this one. Is there? Prophetic energizing and the emergence of amazement. This might be one of the chapters that I didn't have a list to share. I'm going to keep moving. Chapter 5, criticism and pathos in Jesus of Nazareth. So one of the cool things about Brueggemann is he's going to take this into the New Testament. He's going to take it in the Jesus conversation. He's going to look at Jesus as a prophetic voice, probably one of the best prophetic imaginations, and he's going to talk about that. So it talks about the criticism and pathos in Jesus. And he gives some examples of what Jesus criticizes in the culture that he speaks to. He comes and he speaks to I don't just want to say a Jewish culture, because that would miss the point. He actually speaks to a religious culture. And he talks about forgiveness, what the scandal of the teaching of Jesus is forgiveness. He talks about the Sabbath and criticizes the way that even the religious consciousness is engaging in this liberating practice. He talks about table fellowship and how Jesus upended table fellowship. He talks about healing and exorcism. He talks about the place of women in Jesus' ministry, how scandalous and upending that was. He talks about how Jesus engages things like politics, taxes, and debt. Talks about how Jesus engages the temple. All of this offering a criticism to the world that Jesus is trying to speak into. Let's see here. What else do we have? Talks about, let's see, I'm going to go to the next chapter. Energizing and amazement in Jesus of Nazareth. Oh, so the quotes I could read you here. I got to close this video down because I'm running out of time. But, oh man, there's such good stuff in here. But this whole book about the prophetic imagination and what we learned from Moses, how we see it upended, what we see in the prophets, how we see Jesus engage that same conversation, and then where the conversation goes. He ends his book with a chapter on a note on the practice of ministry. And he gives a summary. He talks about just the work of ministry. Ooh, a list. Let's see what he has on this list. Number 1, the task of prophetic ministry is to evoke an alternative community that knows it is about different things in different ways. That's enough. We could just do a video on that. Number 2, the practice of prophetic ministry is not some special thing done 2 days a week. Prophetic ministry seeks to penetrate the numbness in order to face the body of death in which we are caught. This video won't post for a few weeks, but I'm recording this the day after Ash Wednesday. We're in the middle of the Lenten season, and Ash Wednesday invites us to remember that we are from ashes to ashes we will return. There's no denying the reality of death. Prophetic ministry, Ash Wednesday is like a corporate practice of the prophetic imagination. Prophetic ministry seeks to penetrate despair so that new futures can be believed in and embraced. Ooh, man, Brueggemann. Gives a little postscript on practice. Kind of highlights a bunch of ministries that he's seen and really enjoyed. Has a little postscript called In Retrospect, Prophetic Imagination at 40 years after he wrote it. Yeah, just an amazing, I'm telling you, small book. It was only, how many pages? 130 pages. Just power-packed with really, really good, amazing content. So I love how these two books, like two different approaches, two different styles, just really have. But man, that book, just one of those books that I was just like fist pumping, kind of re-energized me, gave me renewed sense of clarity, challenged me, and made me think about some new things. And then, eventually, just to think about the things that book could do for others that might be more towards the beginning of their journey or towards the end of their journey. It's on so many bibliographies in the circles that I listen to and the circles that I run in. This is just a central staple work. Finally got my own copy, and I'm glad I did. So there you go. That's my thought of the day. If it's useful, if it's helpful, love Brueggemann. He's one of my favorite scholars. And there you go. I think we'll probably jump back into our teaching series on the kingdom next week. So look forward to talking to you then.